Has any single one of you sat down and thought about what would happen if everything you once knew slowly disappeared? It's hard to imagine such a catastrophe. It's hard to picture what life would be without everything around us that makes us who we are. This is what makes this novel so captivating. It speaks to the readers and reaches into the mind to learn to value everything around us.
Due to the global pandemic flu, 99% of the population has died. In this novel, death is explored through personal relationships, but more specifically on a global scale. The characters throughout the novel were significantly affected by this flu. However, each character was impacted in a distinct way and was constrained to utilize their own survival tactics. Hi, my name is Veronia, and for today's TED Talk, I'm going to be discussing Station 11 and most importantly, the character Clark Thompson. So Clark Thompson was one of the main characters who survived this catastrophe, and not only that, but had the capability to come back stronger from this disaster. Clark was an aspiring actor who was accompanied by Arthur, his best friend. When the pandemic began to commence, Clark was on the way to the airport to attend the funeral of his best friend who died from a sudden heart attack. Due to the outbreak of the flu, Clark was entrapped in the airport, along with Arthur's ex-wife, Elizabeth Colton, and her son, Tyler. Because Clark would spend many years stranded there, he began to come up with an idea to curate the Museum of Civilization, in which he would collect technological items and other leftovers of civilization. In this TED Talk, we will discuss the many moments Clark had throughout Station 11 and how he was able to maintain his sanity through the catastrophe, and in conclusion, move on to a new world and forget the old world in which he lived.
TED Talk revolves around this thesis. Clark was able to keep his sanity by preserving the positive aspects of his former life and by curating various items that reminded him of his past.
For the first quote, he says, "It makes me happy, it's peaceful, spending hours working on it. It doesn't really matter to me if anyone else sees it." In this quote, Clark is discussing the reason why he initially decided to become a curator. It all began when Clark was on his way to Arthur's funeral. Suddenly, he becomes trapped inside Severn City Airport due to the pandemic outbreak. At first, Clark, who was accompanied by Elizabeth and Taylor, would count the time as if the abandonment was temporary. However, hours became days, days became weeks, weeks became months, and months became years. Year 4 was when Clark finally came to the realization that there was no way out of the airport and they would be confined in that airport for a very long time. Clark would begin to reflect on the past and when he had the freedom to simply eat ice cream, look at a moving bus, or dance at a club. Meanwhile, Clark would reflect on the times he had with his boyfriend and how his boyfriend was a curator. He also noticed that people would seem to cherish the items that he collected, so he came to the resolution that he would collect items to later display at his Museum of Civilization. He collected iPhones, radios, an electric toaster, laptops, motorcycles, etc. With the thought of this museum as a great memory, it would allow him to cope with the loneliness and subtleness of being in that airport for so long. Clark had the ability to maintain his sanity and survive by using his memory and plainly forgetting about the harsh truth of the collapse and just moving forward. He knew that there was no way out, and all he had to do was just accept that the world was changing and merely survive. For the second quote, this quote was spoken by Dr. 11. So she says, "I stood looking over my damaged home and tried to forget the sweetness of life on earth." This quote describes Dr. 11 trying to disregard the assets of earthly life in order to move on. This is a struggle that all the main characters encounter. In Station 11, the world is divided by people who remember and miss the old world, and those who have forgotten or were born after the catastrophe and are able to cope with the world they are currently living in. Despite that, Clark has the ability to reminisce and preserve the memories of life on Earth while still being able to move on and live life in a completely different world. Towards the end of the decade, Clark recognized how much the pandemic flu really affected his life and more so shaped his life. He came into terms with how he was able to survive the Georgian flu. Not only that, but he got to witness firsthand one world ending while a brand new world beginning. Furthermore, he recalls how he got to observe the works and technology of the former world, such as the amplified guitars, the computers, the high-speed trains, or the space shuttles. Clark was able to survive because he had a friend with him, Elizabeth Colton. Elizabeth had faith that the civilization wasn't going to collapse, and the situation wasn't as bad as it seemed. She believed that everything happened for a reason, including the Georgian flu and the death of billions of people. This allowed Clark's mindset to change, and he came to the realization that without him being trapped at the airport, he wouldn't have survived and he wouldn't be the person he ended up being. He learned a valuable lesson, and that is that everything happens for a reason. Additionally, he learned that the technology of modernity shouldn't have been taken for granted. Moreover, Clark feels that since he holds on to all of these memories and was able to survive this catastrophe, he must pass it on to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Quote that supports our thesis is, he was thinking of Robert, his boyfriend of 3 months. Clark wanted very much to see him again. In Station 11, Clark is trapped inside Seven City Airport when the Georgian flu outbreaks across the world. During the first days of his entrapment, Clark begins to reminisce about various relationships with various different people. This is the first way the apocalypse affected Clark. Since the pandemic, Clark has been able to reflect on his life before and after the pandemic. In prior chapters of the book, it excludes Clark's inner thoughts about life, which includes his thoughts about Robert. But inside the airport, he mentions thoughts about his own appearance, including grooming of his facial hair, and the quote I mentioned earlier. I think that the author is trying to distinguish Clark's character between the past and present. This aspect of Clark's character also makes him more relatable. Because he is struggling of what is to come of the future, he decides to focus on a better time, the past. I also think that Clark's character believes that the pandemic is going to wipe out the entire world. When he thinks about wanting to see Robert again, I think he's alluding to the fact that he probably will not see him again. Lastly, I believe that Clark is beginning to lose hope at this time, but he's trying to keep his thoughts positive. Another quote that supports our thesis is, there seemed to be a limitless number of objects in the world that had no practical use, but that people wanted to preserve. The second quote is action that Clark takes about his reminiscent behavior. Instead of just having thoughts about the past, Clark decides to create a museum of things of the present that will one day become extinct. This shows that Clark has used his past to become a curator. Clark creating this museum is important in 2 ways. The first being that he is trying to preserve the past. This shows that Clark wants to hold on to the past by bringing items that can be used to educate or bring joy to people who visit. Even Clark admits that these items are not useful, but they are used for a much greater purpose, which is to inspire and give hope to future generations. Another reason that Clark becoming a curator is important is because Robert was also a curator. Lastly, the creation of this museum is bringing Clark's thoughts into actuality. Many times in the airport, Clark does not show any hope of restoration of his previous life. Instead of being negative, he builds this museum to give hope to people that there will be a better day soon. He knows that nothing will ever be the same, so he's collecting these fossils as a token of the past. Finally, this can be seen as a coping mechanism or a way for Clark to use his time during the apocalypse. Since the Earth is barren during this time period, it gives Clark a reason to live and occupies his time. The creation of the Museum of Civilization connects Clark with his relationship with Robert and gives a reason for him to live.
It is impossible, she said. But there it is. Look again. In the distance, pinpricks of light arranged into a grid. There, plainly visible on the side of a hill some miles distant, a town or a village whose streets were lit up with electricity. This quote signifies the start of a fundamental change in humanity. This conversation between Clark and Kristen takes place in the air traffic control tower at Seven City Airport. Clark has Kristen look through a telescope into the distance where she notices pinpricks of light arranged into a grid. They visibly see a town or village whose streets were lit up with electricity. Her first response was that it's impossible, which indicates how much hope was lost. When Clark was trapped inside the Seven City Airport when the flu broke out, he reminisced on several relationships which stirred the thought process of despair. He knew how to cope by collecting technological items that no longer worked and began a museum since it was a way to keep his boyfriend, who was a curator, close to his heart. As he noticed that people seemed to and appreciate his findings, it gave him a sense of aspiration. I believe Clark learned to accept that this flu was destroying humanity for good and came to a realization that he simply needs to have faith that one day there could be a promising future. The lights represent hope for the future. The lights do not symbolize a phenomenal return of civilization and technology. However, it does provide a glimpse of hope for the future. It shows that humanity will continue to prosper, succeed, and survive. However, survival is insufficient. To provide humanity with an acceptable and reliable future, they need to rebuild civilization and integrate technology into their lives. The advancing of technology was inevitable even before the pandemic occurred. Individuals living in a world so dependent on technology would never be able to survive a world being rebuilt without. Say it now. It's not your imagination, Dolores said. He began to think of Earth as his closest friend. When first being told the one place you call home, the one place you felt somewhat safe and was being destroyed, the initial reaction would be to come back to reality. However, when the worst is the reality, the one thing you can do is adapt. As a population is going extinct, the one reaction to expect from most individuals is panic and fear. The overthinking persona one can possess releases itself uncontrollably and simply because of the unknown of what will happen next, the change. Clark knew the only way to maintain his sanity as the world around him was crashing down was to try his hardest to not think and look at certain things that reminded him of what life was before the pandemic. He tried to not think of his relationship outside the airport, since his new life and newly developed relationships would have been made in the airport. He knew the only way to survive was to be able to face the harsh reality of the collapse, which resulted in him becoming stronger as his character develops. The fate of the future is inevitable, and as a just society, we tend to adapt to our surroundings. The pandemic can be seen as both a tragedy or a necessity that was bound to occur to improve civilization. The book teaches an audience very valuable lessons, such as not being able to control what happens. However, we can control how we react to a situation. It teaches us to broaden our minds and to never take others for granted. As a generation, it teaches us that we need to be the change we wish to see in the world. Survival is insufficient. Staying alive is never enough. In order to live, you must learn, love, and thrive. Clark had to learn how to adapt to his new ways of life and to learn the best ways to cope. He had to watch the world crumble away. However, he also got to see the first glimpse of hope to a new and hopefully better civilization. The new future is in the survival's hands, and they will be able to improve greatly, since the experiences from the past life will always remain. The past will never be forgotten, but it will get better over time. Clark was able to teach us that whatever happens, we find a way to cope with the pain and deal with the reality, because we have no other choice.